ribeye roast, often called prime rib when served as a large roast. This cut comes from the rib section and contains the same heavy marbling that defines ribeye steaks. Those thin streaks of fat melt slowly during cooking, effectively basting the meat from the inside. The result is an exceptionally juicy roast with a deep, rich beef flavor and a tender interior. Prime rib is often roasted slowly and then finished with high heat to develop a dark, savory crust on the outside. Tenderloin roast. It is cut from the tenderloin, a long muscle that runs along the inside of the spine. Because this muscle does very little work during the animal's life, the fibers remain extremely fine and tender. The trade-off is that tenderloin contains very little fat, so it does not have the same bold flavor as rib or chuck cuts. When roasted carefully and finished over higher heat, it produces an exceptionally soft, buttery texture that slices into medallions similar to filet mignon. Tenderloin roasts are usually cooked fairly quickly compared to tougher roasts to preserve that delicate tenderness and smooth bite. Strip loin roast comes from the same section that produces New York strip steaks. When left whole as a roast, the strip loin delivers a balance of tenderness and bold beef flavor. It typically carries a fat cap along one side, which helps protect the meat as it cooks and adds extra richness. Because the muscle itself is already fairly tender, strip loin roasts are usually seasoned simply with salt, then roasted in the oven until the exterior develops a browned crust, before being carved into thick, juicy slices. Tri-tip roast. A triangular muscle from the bottom sirloin with a noticeable fat cap along one side. That fat slowly renders during cooking and helps baste the lean interior, keeping the meat juicy and flavorful. Tri-tip became famous in California's Santa Maria barbecue tradition, where it is seasoned with simple spices and grilled over a wood fire. The smoke and high heat create a browned outer crust while the interior stays tender. After cooking, the roast is sliced thinly across the grain, revealing a juicy interior with a lightly smoky flavor. Picanha roast, also known as the rump cap or top sirloin cap. This cut is instantly recognizable because of its thick, fat cap that sits on top of the meat. Unlike heavily marbled cuts, most of the fat remains on the exterior, where it slowly renders during cooking and flavors the roast from the outside in. As the fat melts, it bastes the surface of the meat and creates a rich, savory crust. Picanha is especially popular in Brazilian churrasco cooking, where it's cut into thick strips, skewered, and grilled with the fat facing the flame. Top sirloin petite roast. A smaller roast taken from the top sirloin section, which sits just behind the short loin. Because these muscles are not as heavily worked as the round or chuck, the meat tends to be more tender while still maintaining a strong, beefy flavor. The petite size also means it cooks relatively quickly compared to larger roasts. It is often seasoned simply with salt and pepper, and roasted until medium rare, producing slices that are tender with a clean, beefy taste. Sirloin tip roast. Despite the name, this cut actually comes from the front portion of the round, near the sirloin. The muscles here strike a balance between lean structure and moderate tenderness. Sirloin tip roast is known for being versatile. It can be roasted, braised, or even sliced into steaks. When roasted whole, it produces flavorful slices with a firm but satisfying texture that are often used for roast beef platters or cold cuts. Top round roast. This cut comes from the inside of the rear leg and is one of the leanest large roasts on the animal. The muscle fibers are tight and uniform, which means the meat slices very cleanly after cooking. For that reason, top round is commonly used for deli-style roast beef. It's usually roasted hot, and relatively quickly to keep the interior moist, then chilled and sliced paper thin for sandwiches where the clean beef flavor stands out. Eye of round roast is a long, cylindrical muscle that runs through the center of the round. It is extremely lean, with very little marbling or internal fat. That gives it a clean beef flavor, but it also means the meat can dry out if overcooked. Eye of round is typically roasted slowly at low temperatures, so the meat cooks evenly without squeezing out moisture. After resting, it is carved into very thin slices that have a firm texture and concentrated beef taste, often used for cold roast beef or sandwiches. Rump roast comes from the upper rear portion of the round, near the hip. Compared to other round roasts, rump roast tends to have slightly more flavor and a bit more fat, though it is still considered a lean cut overall. Because the muscle fibers are dense, many recipes recommend marinating the roast or cooking it slowly to help soften the texture. When roasted properly and sliced thin against the grain, rump roast produces hearty roast beef with a deep, traditional beef flavor. Bottom round roast comes from the outer portion of the cow's rear leg, an area known as the round. Since these muscles are responsible for movement and support, the meat tends to be lean and fairly firm. Bottom round roast is often used as a pot roast or a slow oven roast because added moisture helps compensate for the lack of fat. Many cooks add broth, wine, or vegetables to the pan so the meat stays tender during the long cooking process, while the juices build a rich, savory sauce. Chuck roast. Cut from the shoulder section of the cow, chuck roast comes from muscles that do a lot of physical work during the animal's life. Because of that constant movement, the meat develops strong connective tissue and collagen, which makes it tough if cooked quickly, but extremely flavorful when given time. That is why it is so closely associated with classic pot roast. As it slowly braises in liquid, the collagen breaks down into gelatin, turning a tough cut into something rich, tender, and deeply savory, while the surrounding broth absorbs intense beef flavor. Chuck eye roast comes from the upper portion of the chuck, near where the rib section begins. Because of that location, the chuck eye shares some characteristics with ribeye, including pockets of marbling that add flavor as the meat cooks. It is sometimes called the poor man's ribeye for that reason. While it is not quite as tender as true rib cuts, the chuck eye roast responds well to roasting. Reverse searing is a good finishing method, where the meat cooks gently at first and then finishes with a hot browned crust on the outside. Arm chuck roast comes from the lower shoulder area and often includes part of the arm bone. The muscles here are dense and well exercised, which means the roast carries a lot of connective tissue but also a strong, beefy flavor. It is commonly used for stews and braised dishes, where the meat cooks slowly in liquid. Over time, the connective tissue softens and the roast becomes fork tender, while the surrounding sauce develops a deep, savory richness. English roast. This is another shoulder cut, usually taken from the chuck and sliced so the layers of meat and fat run across the roast. Those alternating layers are what make it ideal for pot roast cooking. As the meat braises, the fat renders gradually and helps keep the interior moist while adding richness to the cooking liquid. The result is tender slices surrounded by a flavorful gravy. Shoulder clod roast. Cut from the large clod muscle in the shoulder, this roast is leaner than many other chuck cuts, but it still carries the characteristic flavor of the shoulder. Because it lacks heavy marbling, the meat doesn't baste itself the way fattier roasts do, which is why it benefits from slower cooking or careful roasting to keep it from drying out. The muscle fibers are fairly long and structured, giving the roast a firmer texture than premium cuts from the rib or loin. When handled correctly, shoulder clod makes excellent roast beef for sandwiches, where the meat is cooked until just tender and then carved into thin slices across the grain. Back rib roast. A bone-in roast from the rib section, where the rib bones remain attached to the meat. The bones help retain heat and slow moisture loss during cooking, which can slightly improve the final texture. As the roast cooks, the fat and connective tissue around the ribs render into the meat, adding extra richness and flavor. The result is a roast that's both flavorful and visually dramatic when carved. The short rib roast is cut from the same section that produces short ribs, but left together as a larger roast. This cut contains significant connective tissue and fat surrounding the rib bones, which makes it ideal for slow braising rather than quick roasting. During long cooking, the collagen melts and the meat softens dramatically, eventually becoming tender enough to pull away from the bone with a rich, almost silky texture. From hardworking shoulder muscles to luxurious rib roasts and delicate tenderloin, roast beef os are defined by where the muscle sits on the animal and how that muscle responds to time, heat, and fat. Let us know in the comments what we should explain next. Thanks for watching.